So good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Nina Levine. Is that too loud? I feel like I'm close to this. I'm Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm standing in tonight for Dean Samuels, who very much wanted to be here and unfortunately had to be somewhere else. But know that he sends his deep regrets and warm welcome and is actually very regretful for what promises to be a very exciting, stimulating evening. So I want to officially welcome you to the 2023 Rudolph C. Barnes Symposium, sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the Philosophy Department, and most importantly by the generous endowment of the Barnes family, established in honor of Rudolph Barnes Sr. Rudolph Barnes Sr. studied at the University of South Carolina, served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and then returned home to become a prominent member of the South Carolina Bar. And for over 40 years, he remained active in charitable and religious organizations. The symposium honors his interests and engagement annually by examining problems of law and morality, broadly construed. I also want to extend a thank you to his son, Rudy Barnes, who is here in the audience tonight. The symposium this year takes as its starting point the current polarized political climate and invites us to think about how this climate has given rise to new challenges, both in politics and in faith communities. How, for example, are anti-democratic influences and Christian nationalism affecting democratic processes, including elections ranging from local school boards to the presidency? Meanwhile, a 2022 survey showed that 40% of pastors were thinking about leaving the ministry, with political division in their congregations among the key reasons. What does this mean for the future of faith, politics, the conservative movement, and American democracy? Tonight, David French will address this cultural shift and its implications for law and society from his perspective as a lawyer, commentator, and a person of faith. He will be joined by USC Associate Professor of Philosophy, Jennifer Frey. Fittingly, our event tonight will take the form, as you can see, of a conversation between David and Jennifer. The plan is for them to talk for about 40 minutes, and then the floor will open for conversations and questions from the audience. I also need to remind you that this event is being live streamed, so please take a moment to turn off cell phones. So before we get started, I want briefly to introduce our two speakers. A prominent political commentator, David French joined the New York Times as a columnist in January 2023. Before that, he was senior editor and founding editor of The Dispatch and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. From 2015 to 19, he was a staff writer for the National Review. He is also, as many of you know, a New York Times bestselling author, and his most recent book, published in 2020, is entitled "A Divided We Fall: America's Succession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation." With a JD from Harvard Law School, David has also made a name for himself as a practicing attorney. He has served as senior counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice and the Alliance Defending Freedom, working on high-profile religious liberty cases. During his legal career, he has litigated in federal courts from coast to coast and served as a lecturer at Cornell Law School. He is a former president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He also served as a major in the U.S. Army Reserve, and in 2007, he was deployed to Iraq and served as a squadron judge advocate and was awarded a Bronze Star. Jennifer Frey is an associate professor of philosophy at USC and a Peter and Bonnie McCausland Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences. Jennifer is also a fellow of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and a Nubingian Fellow with the Carver Project and Interfaith America. She earned her PhD from University of Pittsburgh and her BA from Indiana University. Jennifer publishes widely on ethics and theories of happiness, and is also a rare academic whose work appears in national media, featured, for example, in First Things, Image, Harper's, Plow, The Point, USA Today, and The Wall Street Journal. She hosts a popular podcast on philosophy and literature entitled Sacred and Profane Love. That's a great title, huh? And I need to close with this bittersweet news that starting this summer, she will be leaving us to assume the position as inaugural dean of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa. Anyway, welcome, and I'll let you get started.
Thank you so much, Nina. We're just passing the torch here. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us in what I hope is an important and provocative conversation about faith, politics, and the future of conservatism. And welcome, David, to campus. It's so great to have you here in Columbia.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been here a couple of times recently, and I always enjoy my time.
Yeah, well, you like
the
it.
real USC.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. We love you now. Okay, so David, let's go back a trip down memory lane to 2016. Let's just make it January 2016 for fun. This seems to me to be the point at which the new right starts to take shape. Maybe it's very nebulous back then, but Trumpism and Trump as a veritable candidate comes to be. And I think of you as one of the standard bearers of the old right, you know? And so I'm just wondering if you can walk us through the changes that you've seen on the right since 2016, and just kind of give an explainer on the differences between the old right and the new right. And I think it's important because one of the things that I'm constantly shocked by, genuinely shocked, is the extent to which when I talk to my progressive friends, I'm in academia, so obviously the majority of my colleagues are very progressive, they really have no clue what the new right is. You know, people in my parents' generation still think of conservatism as Reaganism.
Yeah.
So, yeah, old right versus new right. A primer, please.
Yeah. So here's basically a very short history of like the last 10 years.
Sure.
Because if we get too much into this, you'll find out that the new right is actually the old right. And the old right was the new right at a certain point. So
well, walk us through that.
Yeah, so we'll go back to about 10 years ago. And when Mitt Romney was running for president, there was a pretty, I would say a rigorously enforced consensus that there were three legs of the Republican stool, that one of them was social conservatism. Republicans and conservatives are going to be pro-life. They were going to be for pro-religious, they're going to be for religious liberty. The other stool, a leg of the stool, was going to be not truly economic libertarianism in the way that Cato Institute would envision it or the way Reason magazine would envision it, but more limited government, less government interference in the economy, less central planning, less command and control, more deregulation. And then the final leg of the stool was going to be, or was for years, a strong national defense with an emphasis on international alliances and forward engagement. And so that was Reaganism in a nutshell. And for a while, Reaganism not only won the sort of internecine battles on the right, it won in a rout. To such an extent that if you turned on Fox News in, say, 2010, 2011, 2012, people like, say, Sean Hannity would be angry at any deviation. That was what a rhino was back then. A rhino was if you knocked any one of those legs of the stool out. And a lot of the suspicion about Mitt Romney was that he really wasn't all on board with all three components. That yes, economic, yes, on the forward deployed military and strong international alliances, but social conservatism, he was suspect. And so those three legs were the Republican Party and the conservative movement. There was an enormous amount of unanimity. And whenever you have a lot of unanimity, you get fossilization, you get groupthink, a movement that is deprived of any real intellectual diversity can become stagnant. And so by 2015 or so, there was actually a lot of discontent on the right, that it just wasn't working, that this Reaganism was not right for the time. So here comes Donald Trump down the escalator, an intellectual of populist bent. No, I'm kidding. A man of singular personal ambition, okay, who didn't really necessarily have an ideology at all. If you remember back to 2015, 2016, I mean, he threw a bunch of stuff against the wall. He floated single-payer health care. He said that Planned Parenthood did many good things. He advocated ordering the military to commit war crimes. And one of the ways that you would talk about Trump and his interaction with his audience is they were drawn to him attitudinally. They appreciated his combativeness, but there was no there as far as an ideology. And so he would kind of use his audience actually as a giant focus group, his rally audience. And what they would really cheer for, he'd double down on that. And what they didn't love so much, he'd leave that aside. But, so Trump was very, very good, quite obviously, at capturing a crowd. What he was not so good at was creating any kind of intellectual movement at all. Well, for a lot of people who had been discontent with the state of conservatism, that was a giant opportunity. You could fill the empty vessel. And so what a lot of people started to do was fill the empty vessel with actually something that was very much of the old right, the older right, older than Reaganism. So this is going to be America first, it's not fair to call it isolationism, but a more isolationist foreign policy, which is an old strain of the right. You're going to fill it with economic populism, protectionism, etc., which is, again, an old strain of the right. And then you're going to preserve the social conservatism, but with more of an emphasis on state power than perhaps that Reagan social conservatism did. So I grew up in the Reagan social conservatism era where the emphasis was on religious liberty. In other words, give churches freedom, give people of faith freedom, and then with our words and with our actions and with the examples of our lives, we can start to change the United States, and we can sort of reintroduce or introduce or maintain religious influence on the United States of America. But the social conservatism of the Trump era became more authoritarian, more centered around state power. But all of that's old. All of that is what you would call paleo-conservatism in a way. So what made it new wasn't so much the ideology as the temperament, as the disposition. So it was tying a lot of older conservative ideas to the personality and the character of Donald Trump. So that the movement became and again, at no point did Trump say, I agree intellectually. This is the intellectually sounder approach. They poured this into his movement and then imitated and began to adopt his disposition. So the new right, if the old right had an ideological axis and a temperamental axis, it would be the Reagan ideology, the three stools, and then a temperamental approach very much like that of Ronald Reagan, of George H.W. Bush, of George W. Bush. People who, for lack of a better term, could be hard-nosed political fighters, but were also known as gentlemen, as good men, right? And so what Trump did is he said, no to that. No to that. You don't need to be a good guy. In fact, being a good guy could be a real problem because good guys are suckers. And so what you began to see was a new right that adopted an ideology of the paleo right and the disposition of Donald Trump. And so the new right is characterized by the older right ideology and the Trumpist disposition so that it is very, very combative and pugilistic online. It is very, very much known for gang tackling, shaming, attacking people in very personal terms. The new right is oriented around cancel culture. It tries to destroy careers, reputations of people who disagree with it. And so it is very much sort of the moment. It's adopted a lot of the tactics of the far left. You can see them in the new right. So it's an old ideology tied to a Trumpist disposition is how I would characterize the new right. And then there's offshoots from that are sort of more bizarre. So you might have a shoot of integralism, Catholic integralism. You might have a little bit larger shoot of white Christian nationalism or theonomy, which which is sort of like what you might call Protestant integralism. But that's sort of the overall arc of the last 10 years in a super condensed, hyper simplified version.
Well, okay, so it's completely fair that Trump is not an intellectual. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. But he does seem very smart in some sense, in the sense that he saw an opportunity that others didn't see and seized it. And I'm just wondering, in terms of diagnosis, how much you think the recession in 2008 and the failed Second Iraq War, like how much of that created the conditions for the paleoconservatism or the old right to start to get a hold?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The new right, or the paleo argument about economics, didn't really get anywhere for a while. I mean, even well after the recession. If you remember, a lot of the opposition to the bailouts, for example, was a more libertarian kind of argument. It was not that we should have massive state intervention. In that way, George W. Bush was actually kind of more paleo in a way, the big government intervention to rescue the economy. And if you remember, TARP initially failed earlier in 08, before it was ultimately rescued when it looked like all the banks were going to collapse. And so for years after 08, Reaganism maintained its hold. Years after 08, there was a strong sense in the Republican Party that the Iraq War was not a mistake. There was even polling done in the last few months indicating that by a slim majority, Republicans still don't believe the Iraq War was a mistake. So it's been incredibly overblown, I think, the extent to which the Iraq War played a role in Trump's rise. I mean, look, he just was all over the place about it, and then he settled on being against it. And economically, he was all over the place. But if you do look at a common strand with Trump, he has always been somewhat protectionist. He's always had that as a goal, but that was not even that out of the mainstream of the Republican Party, because remember, George W. Bush implemented some rather controversial tariffs in the steel sector. And so, Trump, what Trump capitalized was the disposition. The right was a lot angrier than the Republican establishment recognized. It wasn't ideologically discontent. My neighbors in Nashville were not running around going, you know what we need a lot less of? NATO. And you know what we need, like, a lot more of? Tariffs. That was not happening. Yeah. But what my neighbors were saying is, well, you know what we need a lot more of is fighting. The left is running roughshod over us. And then when Trump gave his speech about, Mexicans and rapists, and some of them are good people, and he didn't back down an inch, that's what really launched him. It wasn't so much that I will say he did capture the zeitgeist of the grassroots on immigration. I completely agree with that. But that's been a battle back and forth for a very long time. And, Romney, remember in 2012, said, well, we got to make it to where people self-deport. That wasn't an open immigration position. So he captured the disposition. And when you look back and you sort of review the Tea Party in that light, was the Tea Party really, truly about a bunch of people reading Hayek and handing out pocket constitutions? Or was it really at its core about fighting Barack Obama? I think in hindsight, you would say it was a lot less about Hayek and a lot more about fighting Barack Obama. And so he caught that disposition. But you can't just run a country on a disposition. You have to have some ideas. You have to have some philosophies. And over the course of his administration, the administration changed a great deal in personnel. So it starts with an old school Reagan Republican staff, with old school Reagan Republican staffing. By 2020, it's not that at all. In 2017, his policy initiatives, the biggest thing he got through was a tax cut designed by Paul Ryan. His biggest judicial accomplishments were nominating judges who were the members of the leading establishment legal organization in the United States of America, the Federalist Society. They would have been nominated by any Republican. So it is apex of his effectiveness. He was implementing a lot of Reagan Republican agendas, but then as he became more alienated from that Republican establishment, or as the Republican establishment bent to him, it then became more wholly a creation of not just Trump's disposition, but also the people who were drawn to Trump as that opportunity to turn the page ideologically.
Yeah, so if you want to kind of separate the policy from the disposition or the character, let's talk about that disposition or the character. I mean, you talked about people being angry or people wanting to, I don't know, do some culture warring, fight the left. But what is it specifically about Trump and then maybe Trumpism that has to do with a certain disposition or character?
Yeah, so, you know, if you go back, so I was born in 1969. I'm a Cold War kid. So I come of age. I don't remember Watergate. Like, I was 5 when Nixon resigned. My first real memory of politics was the hostage crisis. My first real happy geopolitical moment was when we beat the Soviets in 1980, hockey, you know. But I do remember in the late 70s and the 80s, I do remember that malaise. I do remember this sense that things were spiraling out of control. I was a hopeless nerd even back then. So when I wasn't playing Dungeons and Dragons, I was reading books about American geopolitics. Oh, and Lord of the Rings 17 times or something like that. But
it's a good book.
And so, you know, there was this real sense of American decline, right? There's this real sense that the Soviets were ascendant. And then along comes Reagan. In the 12 years from Reagan to Bush, we go from a sense of America's in decline to the end of the first Bush term, in the only Bush term, America was the only superpower left standing, to such an extent that French diplomats coined this term hyperpower. And then Bush loses after, you know, the Reagan, in my view, like the Reagan movement were like, hey, America, we revived the economy and ended the Cold War. You're welcome. And they're like, thanks, bye. And they elected Bill Clinton. So here comes Bill Clinton after these 12 years of Republicans, and I'm sorry to any Democrats in the audience, he's a bad guy. Like, he's not a good guy. I mean, just read Juanita Broderick's allegation against him.
You're not going to get an argument from me.
Yeah, he's a bad guy. So Republicans, in my mind, it had really fixed in my mind. There's the temperamental dispositional axis, and then there's the ideological. And the other thing about conservatism is because we believed in a more limited government, it really put a high premium on personal virtue. A country is really going to thrive not because its government is powerful, but because its people are good. And if its people are going to be good, there has to be a good example. There has to be, and I'm not going to say that all Republicans were great people. I mean, Newt Gingrich had problems. Like, you know, there were Republicans who had problems. But as a general matter, the thought was, you know, if we're going to have a great nation, we need to have virtue. There has to be virtue, especially if you're going to put a premium on restricting the reach and the scope of government. People have to step up. And by the 2010s, 2011, 2012, 2013, moving into that, what you began to see was much more increased polarization. People started to hate members of the opposing party. Prior to the early 2000s, most partisanship was not what's called negative partisanship. And what is negative partisanship? Negative partisanship is when you belong to your political party not because you love your positions, but because you hate or fear the other side. And so moving through Clinton and past Clinton, except with a bump after 9/11, we began to have this increasing negative partisanship. So the reason why we belong to our party is because of opposition to the other party, less than adherence to our own ideas. And so when push came to shove, what in the hierarchy of values was most important? Was it the ideas that I really care about, or was it my dislike for you people? And if the instant my dislike for you people achieved the top spot in the hierarchy, Trump was inevitable, or a version of Trump, in my view, was inevitable. The moment that opposition to other human beings was more important than support for your own ideas. And I think and there's a million reasons for that polarization that we can go into. I wrote a bunch of them in my book that is now 3 years, goodness, almost 3 years old. But we did begin to hate each other more. Even as early as 2014, if you ask the average Republican, do you somewhat like, or somewhat dislike, or strongly dislike a Democrat? Even as early as 2014, it was about 80% of Republicans either strongly disliked or somewhat disliked Democrats. The same poll was asked of Democrats, and as befitting their reputation for tolerance, only 78% of them either hated or strongly disliked Republicans. And so the nation was ready for somebody who was going to come, and the chief quality they were going to exhibit was oppositionalism, was combativeness, was pugilism. The seed had been sown for that long before.
Yeah, so if it's this kind of, I hear this all the time in conservative circles, right? That I'm tired of losing. I want to win, as if like you hadn't won a whole bunch of really important battles. But I just kind of want to ask a more philosophical question, I guess. I'm a philosopher, and also most of my work centers around virtue. I see some of my students here, so they know this. But, why? Look, I'll just play devil's advocate, right? Because the devil's advocate argument goes like this. I'm sick of losing. I want a winner, like Trump was a winner, and I'm going to go with that because it's going to get me the policies that I want. And at the end of the day, it's going to get the people on the court that I want. It's going to get the policies that I want. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters, or that's what matters most. And so maybe character is nice, but it's definitely a secondary or a subsidiary concern. So I would just invite you, and this, I'm a friendly interlocutor, but why does character really matter if having a good character means we're going to lose?
Well, first, I'm disputing whether having a good character means you're going to lose, because it became quite popular to say, what did conservatism ever conserve?
Right.
Well, you can talk to a progressive, and they're not going to sit there and say, we were winning and we were routing people, and it was Conan the Barbarian, It's to burn the villages, to see your enemies driven before you and hear the lamentation of their women. Like, that was not the way progressives were viewing America. One of the most insightful pieces before the 2016 election was written in CBS News, and it said both sides think they're losing, and both sides are losing on key issues that are important to them. And you might be on the right here saying, what? What was the right winning? Well, that's pretty easy. One of the biggest public policy routes in modern history is the route on gun rights. If you go back to 1986, your ability to own or carry a gun outside to carry a gun outside the home for self-defense was almost non-existent. Texas was not even a shall issue state on a carry permit. The change in gun laws has been massive, titanic. If you look at abortion, a lot of people think, well, the right lost on abortion nonstop until Trump's judges. And I'm grateful for Trump's judges as a pro-life attorney, and I've been a pro-life attorney my entire legal career. But if you look at abortion, after the peak of the abortion rate in 1980 or 80-81, it declined through every president until by the time Trump took office in 2017, it was lower than it had been before Roe. And that hundreds of pro-life laws had been passed in the United States of America during that time, hundreds. Now, there are other areas where social conservatives had suffered real defeats. Social conservatives were very angry about Obergefell, for example. My former National Review colleague has said it quite well. He said, the United States of America in the 21st century has become more pro-life, more pro-gun, and more pro-gay. And so that is not a story of one side winning everything and one side losing everything. It's just not the way it goes. And there were major economic reforms that conservatives undertook that worked, that contributed to American prosperity. So this idea that one side was winning everything and one side was losing everything was just fiction. And it was exactly what you'd expect in a closely divided country. One side was winning some things and losing other things. And it was quite within the normal realm. Now, so that sort of fundamental foundation that we win nothing was just false. Then the second thing is, what about character? Why is character important? Well, from the beginning of the Republic, the smartest founders knew that with this kind of republic, character was absolutely vital. Absolutely vital. One of the most important documents to read from the founding era is John Adams' letter to a Massachusetts militia. And it has the very famous quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other." That's the famous sentence, but you should read the whole thing, and because it describes what he means. And what he means is we did not create a government with the power to restrain human vice. The government as it was created was just simply not given the totalitarian power to restrain human vice. And if you read Federalist Number 10 by Madison, he talks about how the danger of faction could rip this country apart. And the answer to that is not to choke off liberty, but the answer to that is to allow a multiplicity of factions to prosper. So we were designed from the ground up ideally, although we did not live up to those ideals initially, and we're not perfectly living up to them now. We were designed for pluralism. We were designed for liberty. We were not designed for state control. And we could not be designed for state control. We were already too diverse for a massively powerful centralized government. We would have recreated the wars of religion really quickly if we had something like that. So we have a nation designed for the ground up to depend on character. And so here's what's happened when character degrades. So a lot of people look at the Trump era and they say, well, we got some wins. And there were some wins for conservatives. Number one among them was reversal of Roe in the Biden administration, but due to Trump's judges and Bush's judges, by the way, it was George W. Bush who wrote the opinion. And so you did get that reversal of Roe, a tremendous win. You had some other wins. I thought the Paul Ryan tax cut was like a B minus. I mean, there was some good stuff. But if you look at our society, what happened between 2017 and 2021? For the first presidency since Carter, the abortion rate went up. The murder rate went up. The marriage rate, which had been declining during much of the sexual revolution, actually stabilized during the Obama administration and then plunged during the Trump administration. Deaths of despair, which had been rising steadily, spiked by the end of the Trump administration. You can go through social indicator after social indicator after social indicator that depends on human beings making good choices, that very critically depends on human beings feeling a sense of hope for the future. What is more hope for the future than marriage and childbearing? Marriage rate plunges, fertility rate continues to decline, abortion rate increases. And so this is what happens when a society's moral fabric begins to unravel. And those people say, well, it might have been worth it because we had to take on the wokes. I didn't see wokeism receding in power during the Trump administration. There was such a sense of emergency that a lot of center-left people bound themselves tightly to radicals on the left because their thought was, we all have to hang together or we're going to hang separately. And so what ended up happening is, yes, there were some policy victories, but the social fabric of the United States of America decayed dramatically during those 4 years. And now that we're 2 years out of it, all of that is quite obvious. All of those numbers are out there. And as somebody who's pro-life, I'm particularly grieved that the abortion rate went up for the first time in 40 years.
But are you tracing that causally to, like, Trump's character, or?
It's not entirely. I mean, obviously, one person cannot do that.
Right.
Right. But there's a reason why we call the presidency the bully pulpit, right? And there's also a cultural effect of leadership. So I think of it like this. A leader, and every one of us belongs to some institution somewhere, and in your institution, what you see that you belong to, a leader is somebody who sets a cultural tone. It's like, imagine that they're setting the course of a river in that organization. And you can swim against the tide for a while, and then you'll get exhausted and maybe drown, or just drift with it. Or you swim off to the bank and you get out of that institution entirely. And what happened on the American right was this rise of pugilism and libertinism. And when I mean libertinism, I don't just mean like sexual hedonism, although there was a big part of that on the right as well. Have you heard the term barstool conservatives? So, or what my New York Times colleague Jane Coaston calls horny bro conservatism.
Yep.
That's libertinism, right? But there's another form of libertinism, and libertinism that might be not sexually unrestrained, but unrestrained in other ways. Unrestrained in your temper, unrestrained in your temperament, unrestrained in your honesty, or your dishonesty. I'm sorry. Look at what we saw with Fox News. What we saw in Fox News with systematic, intentional lying set from the top of the organization. And that is rot. That's libertinism. And so when libertinism begins to overtake a movement, it has major cultural consequences. And so it's not just Trump, it's layer after layer. Guys, I've investigated scandals in church that I never thought I would ever see in my life. And then what's even worse about it is there are people who will not face the scandal because they fear that by exposing scandals in churches, you're going to give ammunition to the left. Well, that's not our call as Christians. You know, it's not do justice unless, or it's not act justly unless acting justly helps Joe Biden. You know, that's not, so we began to, our institutions began to rot, our people became more libertine, and our social fabric began to fray.
Yeah, I mean, something that's kind of interested me, and we talked about this a little bit earlier today, is, you know, there's a kind of shift that I have observed. Is kind of started off with, well, I voted for Trump, but it was really just voting against the Democratic platform, right? And so it's very distasteful, but I held my nose and I voted for the lesser evil, etc. But then a little bit later, you see actually an admiration for Trump. And it's no longer holding your nose, but a kind of unbridled enthusiasm. And these are people who, in their personal lives, I think, and even in other areas, would say that character is very important, but it's not overriding, right? what is overriding again is winning.
Yeah.
And, finally we have a winner, although not really, because it turns out he lost. But this is like the overriding thing. And one thing that's kind of interesting to me is just someone who has devoted my life to being an advocate for the importance and role of character at every level in society, is the extent to which religious conservatives have really openly embraced totally secular, even anti-religious, neo-pagan, Nietzschean neo-pagan forms of conservatism. So Nate Hochman, who's kind of like a young conservative, wrote this really interesting piece in the New York Times, which I think was called "What Comes After the Religious Right?" And this is, I'll just quote briefly from his piece. He wrote that the new coalition is focused on questions of national identity, social integrity, and political alienation. Although it enjoys the support of most Republican Christians who form the electoral backbone of the old moral majority, it is a social conservatism rather than a religious one, revolving around race, identity politics, immigration, and the teaching of American history. So this is where things like Bronze Age pervert come in, for example, and various forms of just kind of like alt-right, white supremacist kind of stuff. And you see this kind of like, what I see is people who are like, yeah, that's bad, but this other stuff is worse. But how much do you think, my real question here, I promise there's a question, is like, how much of the new right is post-Christian?
A huge amount of it, including in the church.
Okay, I definitely want you to say more about that.
A huge amount of evangelical political activism is post-Christian. So what I saw with my own eyes, so I live in an 85% Trump neighborhood in Middle Tennessee, which isn't just the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. Nashville isn't just the belt buckle, it's the Jerusalem. Like, we've got the Southern Baptist Convention there, we've got the Christian music industry there, we've got the Christian publishing industry there. I mean, we're the Jerusalem of American evangelicalism. And this is what I saw with my own eyes. 2016, you're exactly right. Look, David, I am absolutely, I find Trump repugnant. But I have a hard choice to make. It's going to be him or Hillary Clinton. And look, my conscience won't let me vote for Hillary Clinton. Trump is at least going to be pro-life. And my position was, I'm not going to vote for either one of them because I do not believe in a lesser of two evils voting. And I wasn't actually quite sure who was going to be worse. And so I said, I'm not going to vote for either one of them. But I understand that decision. But let me ask you this. When Trump is president, if he lies, will you call him out on his lies? If he acts in a manner that is destructive to the body politic, will you call him? Yeah, of course. Yes, absolutely. And so I totally understood the decision to vote for Trump. What I did not understand was the decision to first rationalize and then ultimately embrace behavior that bore no resemblance to the kind of behavior that followers of Jesus Christ should exhibit. And I had more than one friend who was holding their nose in anguish on November of 2016, who was in the third bass boat in the boat parade in 2020. And part of what was going on here is a very human thing. It is very human that we do not actually like to support the lesser evil. There's a reason why at political rallies no one is chanting, lesser evil, lesser evil. You want to feel like you're a part of something good, right? And so what Trump was absolutely not going to give you, aside from some policy wins, was virtue. You could demand it of him, you could beg him for it. He was not going to give you virtue. So you were in this position where you're saying, do I continue to believe that I'm just holding my nose in lesser evil, or do I start to change? And I think, actually, these guys deserve it on the other side. Or the times are so dark that they require desperate times, desperate measures. And so over time, what I saw people morph into was what they called evil in 2016, they called good in 2020. And there is a scripture that's directly on point on this. Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who call light darkness and darkness light. And this is what came about within the American, much of the, not all, of course, but much of the American evangelical community. And then they began to adopt his own tactics and his own character and disposition in politics. And so I have never in my life encountered more vile cruelty than I have encountered from often Christian Trumpists.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
You've seen it.
Oh, I have.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what ended up happening, and you would think, how does this happen? How does this happen? Well, part of it is there was a massive failure of spiritual formation in politics. So if you grow up in church, like I did in an evangelical church, you are taught how to be a Christian businessman, or how to be a Christian student, or how to be a husband or a father. And it's not all results oriented. Like the definition of a great Christian student is not all A's. Mm-hmm. Or the definition of a great Christian businessman is not the highest, most profitable business in town. And if a Christian businessman goes through trouble, like he's about to lose his house, he's got to have to pull his kids out of the school that they're going to be in. They might have to move. It strains on the marriage. And somebody says, you know what you need to do? Just a little light consumer fraud. just for a month or two, to right the ship financially, and then you can go back to integrity. Your average Christian businessman is going to say, no, I trust Jesus. I trust God. He's got my family. I am not going to sacrifice my integrity for my business. And then the guy says, okay, tell you what, you don't have to lie, but I know this guy. You can hire him, and he will lie for you. Just for a few months, and you'll be fine. No one says, okay, my hands are clean. I've hired the liar. I'm not the liar. Let he who has ears to hear, let him hear on this analogy. And so what we've done in politics is we've exempted politics from that. And what spiritual formation for me in the evangelical church was called worldview training. And I'm sure there's some people in this room who had worldview training. And if you remember worldview training, it was all issues. It was, why is capitalism better than communism? Why are we pro-life? Why are we pro-religious liberty? And over time, what it created in the evangelical church was a mindset that essentially we were nothing more than sort of a trade association that met and sang hymns every week. Like, our demands as an evangelical church are these policies. So you're a politician. Let's see, I've got the Oil and Gas Association at 11:30, got the evangelicals at 12, and then character just slid away. When the church is called to so much more than that. We're salt, we're light. Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly, it is to love kindness, and it is to walk humbly before the Lord your God. And I ask you, does that characterize Christian political engagement in the United States of America today? It does for some. There are some, and I know some Christian politicians even on the Hill, who that characterizes them. Not as a group, it doesn't. And that's what I mean by the post-Christian religious right.
Doesn't sound like winning, David.
It doesn't sound like winning. No, it doesn't.
Humility never wins.
Especially not in God's economy.
Yeah.
Not in God's economy.
Okay, well, I have to bring in Christian nationalism because it's in the title of the event.
It's in the title. We got to get there.
And so Matthew Rose, who is a conservative intellectual who wrote an essay in a conservative magazine, First Things, it was in 2019. It was exposing the very explicitly white nationalist roots of contemporary American first politics in this country. And he traced it back to a figure named Samuel Francis. Mm-hmm. And he ends up arguing that, look, these nationalist and populist movements that Francis himself anticipated, they can succeed in challenging liberalism, but only to the extent that they abjure and reject Francis's racial resentments, right, which are at the heart of it. and assert the common goods and transcendent horizon that his more materialist thinking denies. And he's at great pains in the essay to point out that Samuel Francis is not only not a Christian, but is very antithetical to Christianity as like losers, right? You're losing, right? Mm-hmm. And we need winners. And so I'm just kind of wondering, look, can Christian nationalism ever be a multiracial, diverse movement? Can it do what Matthew Rose says it needs to do, which is assert the common goods and transcendent horizon that really is at the heart of Christianity, which of course is a universal religion?
So white or nationalism that comes from the American South has never been separated from white Christian nationalism. The American, I grew up in the South, and I grew up knowing almost instinctively that Southern populism was always going to be racially tinged. And a populist Southern religion was racially tinged. And sometimes a lot more than racially tinged. I mean, a lot more than tinged. Now, the problem that we have here is that white Christian nationalism is both not serious and dangerous at the same time. And here's what I mean by that. But first, let's define our terms.
Yeah, because it's a very protean concept.
Yeah. So let's define our terms, because defining our terms will help us understand the whole discussion. So I'll tell you first what Christian nationalism is not. It is not Christians being involved in politics and bringing their Christian values into the political sphere. Every person of every faith or no faith at all brings their core values into the political sphere, right? This is something that every person of every faith does. So if somebody says, well, as a Christian, I oppose the death penalty, that is not Christian nationalism. Or as a Christian, I'm pro-life. That is not Christian nationalism. Anything more than it is when you say, as a Jewish person, I believe in restorative justice. That is not Jewish nationalism, right? And so it is not bringing your faith into the public square. So what is it? Well, there's an intellectual definition, and there are a set of intellectual definitions, but the most important one is the emotional component. So the intellectual definitions are varied, but there's something along the lines of, for example, God has a quite specific purpose for the United States of America that is through this country that he will accomplish his purpose with the church. It is through this country as a particular anointed divine vessel that he is going to implement his rule and reign. That is one kind of definition of Christian nationalism. Another one is kind of an older version, which is, this is a Christian nation, and it will be governed by Christians in accordance with Christian morality, and Christian morality, as much as possible, will be made the law of the land. Mm-hmm. So that's another more version of it. And a lot of people even folks who absolutely circle their Baptist church with American flags on 4th of July would reject that, and they said that that's not right. I mean, it's Jesus first, America well below Jesus. And they could pass a polygraph if you gave them a polygraph. Do you really believe that? But the core of what we're dealing with is not so much a theology or even a comprehensive ideology. And you can find books that have been written that will describe a comprehensive ideology. And you read just a few pages and you'll realize this is never happening in the United States of America. But a larger group of people have a deep emotional, almost a visceral feeling that the fortunes of the United States of America or the fortunes of the church are directly tied to the fortunes of the United States of America. And even more specifically, that the health of the church is directly tied to the health of my political movement. Mm-hmm. And it's a deep emotional bond that is formed. Thomas Kidd, the historian at Baylor, wrote something in the Gospel Coalition a couple of years ago that was really, really good. And he said, look, it's this deep, deep emotional feeling that is the real issue. And he talked about seeing a sign that said, Trump 2024, make faith great again. That's not a theology. It's an emotional impulse. And so really what's the dangerous thing is tying at a visceral level our religion and our politics and our national identity so closely together that you can't pull them apart if you tried. And it's not a theology. It's something that is deep in your gut. And this is what I see, and that's what I encounter. And there is, and some of this is actually kind of one of the kind of tail end consequences of the Cold War, to be honest. Because the Cold War was a battle against an immense, explicitly atheistic genocidal empire in the Soviet Union. And so one of the contrasts between the West and the Soviet Empire was we respected faith. We were a faith-filled people. If you look at some of the markers, a lot of people don't really realize this, but the inclusion of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance is a Cold War artifact. In God We Trust is a Cold War artifact. This is how we distinguished ourselves from the Soviet Union. It's not something that goes back to our founding. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Christian nationalism more often than not. It's not this thing that people argue about on Twitter that is, somehow we're going to recreate John Calvin's Geneva in Moscow, Idaho, although somebody's trying to do that.
Yes, they are.
It's more like my Christian faith must be made manifest in the laws of this land, and by the way, the health of the church depends directly on the health of this republic.
Yeah, that's kind of weird to me as a Catholic, but all. This is like kind of my last thing, and then we are going to open it up to audience questions. But one of the defining moments of the New Right, it seems to me, was a very famous hit piece directly against you by Sohrab Ahmari in First Things, and the title of this essay was Against David Frenchism. And this inaugurated what I like to call David French derangement syndrome, whose symptoms mostly manifest themselves on Twitter. But the crux of that piece is actually very interesting. So the crux of the piece is that your supposedly good qualities, your decency and your civility, are actually rooted in your bad philosophical commitments. So you sincerely believe in liberal neutrality, constitutionally understood, and so you believe that America can accommodate both traditional Christianity and the libertine ways and paganized ideology of the other side. I'm quoting Ahmari now. And Ahmari accuses you of being blind to the fact that liberalism is not neutral, right? That its inexorable logic is to strangle traditional ways of life and to adopt a notion of autonomy that is kind of unlimited, right? And that notion of unlimited autonomy, which you can see, for example, in the KCV Planned Parenthood piece written by Kennedy, is really just at odds with social conservatism and always will be. And so we really have to reject liberal neutrality. And if we reject liberal neutrality, then we will see that we're at war. And when you're at war, civility is just not important, right? Decency is not important. You want to win. And this, he basically accuses you of being a moral narcissist for caring about character, right? That it's, he says, this is literally a quote, "As anyone familiar with the Amelia Sedley character in Vanity Fair knows, a kind of airy above-it-all mentality can supply its own vain satisfactions." So I wonder now, it's been a while since this came out. How would you respond to Ahmari today? Would you concede anything to him? Would you meet him halfway?
Oh, gosh, no. I wouldn't concede. I wouldn't concede 1/10 of 1/10 of 1 millimeter to him.
Good to know.
Yeah. So first, let's deal with the civility and decency element of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a Christian. Sohrab is a Christian.
Yes.
The command, the the notation of who we are as Christian, the fruit of the Spirit, kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control, this is not until it doesn't work in politics, right? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Bless your enemies. These are not tactics to be pursued until they don't work in the political sphere. They are commands given to a people groaning under the weight of oppression that we Christians in the United States of America cannot begin to comprehend. Mm-hmm. You know, I was reading an essay some time ago that talked about how negative America is to Christianity right now. And one of the elements, and I do not deny that there are a lot of people who don't like Christianity in the United States of America. He talked about me having an area above it all mentality. I spent 21 years litigating religious liberty in courts from coast to coast. That's not above anything. I was in the legal trenches, right? And so when you're talking about these commands, like in this essay, one of the things was, one of the reasons why we're in such a negative world is they referred to Tim Keller, the very popular and a friend of mine, wonderful man, wonderful evangelical pastor in New York. He had an award revoked from him. He was going to be given an award by Princeton Seminary, and it was revoked from him for his stance on LGBT issues. And that was evidence of, look, how negative America is. And I was thinking, let me pull a Christian from the first century up here. I mean, like, Theophilus, I know you're about to be fed to the lions, but let me tell you about our challenges right here. Okay, I'm eager to hear. Well, there's this celebrity pastor. Let me stop you right there, David. What's a celebrity pastor? What's an extremely famous pastor with a following of millions? Can I stop you again? Did you just say millions of people? Yeah, he has a following of millions, and he pastors a mega church. Again, I'm not familiar with this term. We go to the First Catacomb Church of Christ, and there's like 9 of us, and 4 of us are going to die tomorrow. So tell me about this. Yeah, well, it's a really big church, and a lot of people in the city don't like that it's there. I mean, you get the idea. And what was the message to old Theophilus back then? It was, love your enemies. What did Jesus do on the cross? Again, being crucified by a horrific secular power. He did not do what a Saturday night, there's a memorable Saturday Night Live skit. Do you remember the movie Django Unchained? Mm-hmm. It was called Jesus Uncrossed. And it was spelled D-J-E-S-U-S. Mm-hmm. And it was like The Rock with a cross on his back and 2 machine guns just mowing people down. Like, that's not what...
Sounds like sacrilege.
That's not what he did. It's not what he did. As he was being crucified by horrific secular power, he said, Father, forgive them to the soldiers crucifying, for they know not what they do. So this idea that it's so bad in the United States of America that we should abandon biblical commands of civility and decency, I just don't find scriptural sanction for that at all. I think we're supposed to obey. Jesus said, take up your cross. He didn't say, I'm going to the cross so that you may rule. He said, take up your cross. So we live in a whole different economy and calculus. So that's one thing. The other thing is this idea that classical liberalism, that's sort of the view, the belief in the inherent worth of the founding principles of the United States of America, are inherently destructive, that they're degrading and eroding of human virtue, I think is just fundamentally wrong. In fact, I think classical liberalism, unlike more authoritarian governing structures, recognizes 2 great truths about humanity. One is human beings are of incalculable worth. Well, this is shown in all men are created equally and are endowed by a creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Human beings have incalculable worth. One of the single greatest statements of human rights in the history of man is the American Bill of Rights, supplemented by the Civil War amendments. Those 2 documents, Civil War amendments Bill of Rights, tremendous legal documents making operative the dignity of man. Now, what's the other truth, though? Mankind is also fallen. We make mistakes. There's a great book called We the Fallen People that I'm going to recommend about the understanding of the fallenness of man in the American founding. And so what does that do? It says we're not going to concentrate power in the hands of any one person or any one entity. Why is that? Because we recognize that no matter how any one person or entity may cloak itself in faith or Christianity, it can turn darkly oppressive quickly. We have to check mankind's fallen nature. And so I'm quite interested in this idea that if we only reconnected church and state, if we only started to really diminish human liberty, that then we'll be better off. One of the reasons why classical liberalism was constructed was because of the genocidal wasteland of Central Europe that emerged after the wars of religion. And these were people of faith who tightly tied church and state and fought each other until they just couldn't fight anymore, until the cost was too terrible, it was too great. And then they began to devise a system of living that allowed people to live together across differences. I love what the pseudonymous writer Scott Alexander said about classical liberalism. He said it's like an alien technology engineered to avoid civil war. It contradicts our human nature because we have a will to power. And what liberalism does is it checks that will to power to allow other people to live. And I think of another verse from Micah that really puts this in context. And interestingly enough, this is one of George Washington's favorite verses. He used it almost 50 times in his writing, most famously when he wrote to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island. And this is an incredibly persecuted religious minority. Anti-Semitism is an ancient hatred, And this incredibly persecuted religious minority is turning to the new president of a new republic and asking, where do we fit in this land? In Washington, and we know Washington had flaws, we know that, but this was not one of them. In his response to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island, he quoted Micah 4:4. Every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And I think that is a beautiful vision of pluralism. Micah 6:8, what are we called to do? Act justly, love kindness, and walk humbly before the Lord our God. To what end? So that every man can live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And I have seen no system of government accomplish that better, and I'm not saying that American small L liberalism, than small L liberalism. It is the only system that we have seen to be able to sustain a diverse people living and prospering together. And the instant you turn away from that, the will to power sets in, and the miracle of this American experiment will dissolve in blood as it has dissolved in blood before. Because don't ever forget, for all of those who long for this idea that we all used to have a common faith, remember Lincoln's second inaugural. Both sides pray to the same God. Both sides. Both sides' prayers, and neither side's prayers were fully answered. And what was the result? The deadliest war in all of American history, far more deadly than World War II. So this idea that we can then decide that we are going to restore a religious system of governance and that will restore harmony is contradicted by everything we know about history. And the last reading recommendation I'll make that is going to do absolutely nothing to quell any talk that all I am is some nasty New York Times elitist is
Go ahead.
Soren Kierkegaard and his attack on Christendom. Read Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom. And now he's indicting a state church. But if you read it and you read it instead through the power of a warped and distorted version of Christian authority, it's a very, very powerful and even contemporary read, although not an easy read.
Yes, well, I can definitely get on board with the recommendation of reading Kierkegaard. So I want to open it now to questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones on either side of the aisle. So if anyone would like to ask David a question, you can just form a queue. And we have about 15 minutes for questions. And just say your name and then ask your question.
Okay, my name is Roger Keene. Thank you for coming here. This is a bit more of a personal and a faith-based question. I've been following you since the French press and before at the Dispatch. And something that I see in you, with Russell Moore, with Beth Moore, with people in your kind of space is, here you are, you're presumably a good faith member of your church. You want your church to act with integrity and honor, and you see that not happening with Camp Kanakuk or the Southern Baptist sexual abuse allegations or whatever. So you bring this up in the hopes that the institution will correct itself, that there'll be a moment of reckoning. And instead, a lot of the people on your own team, and I'm just speaking broadly here, you have this experience. Yeah. The people on your own team start saying, do you want these people to win? Do you want the libs to win? Shut up, David.
Yeah.
And this is happening, and they're calling you names and a cuck and a sellout and whatever. And then in the meantime, people with whom you have no common faith say, why can't they all be like David French? Why can't they all be winsome and reasonable and kind? Has that ever caused you, I feel like you'd have to be superhuman not to start to develop warmer feelings towards the people who aren't your brothers and sisters in Christ? It's something I struggle with personally in my own. And have you ever had any kind of experience like that?
I mean, I think all of us respond to kindness well. So if you're just a human being and somebody is being kind to you, your heart's going to warm towards them, right? It's one of the reasons why you often see somebody go from one extreme to another extreme, because they might have been canceled and treated horribly by the far right or by the far left. And then suddenly you say, well, why are they always on Fox News now? Or why are they always on MSNBC? It's because 2 things are going on. One, we long for community. We long for it. We're built for community. And the second thing is we respond to kindness and we're repelled by cruelty. So one of the things that I try to do is I try to be a person, I don't always succeed, but I try to treat people with kindness, not just because it's a biblical command, but because I know how people need it, right? And so, yeah, if someone's kind to me, I'm going to respond to that. Absolutely. It's like finding an oasis in the desert. But you also have to know where your convictions are. And so, for example, I've been pro-life my whole life. Ever since I knew what abortion was, right? My first pro-life activist action was my sophomore year of college, where I tried to get my Christian college to drop a rule that said that every woman who got pregnant at school out of wedlock had to be suspended or expelled. Because I was like, you're going to encourage abortion because people are going to be losing their community. And then when I got to Harvard Law School, I formed the first pro-life group at Harvard Law School. So I'm not going to abandon my conviction because somebody who's pro-choice is kind to me. But I'm absolutely going to appreciate and value somebody who's pro-choice. I'm going to value their kindness, and I can still appreciate the qualities that they have, right? And so I think that you have to have a moral center and a moral core. Who are you really? And I am not perfect in this at all. But if you're going to ask me, who am I really? Who are you really? I hope my answer is a follower of Jesus Christ. That's who I am really. And if that's who you are really, that's at the apex of the hierarchy of your values. All of the other things often you don't really learn until they're tested. I love how C.S. Lewis phrases what courage is. He says it's the form of every virtue at its testing point. So you don't know if you're honest until it's difficult to tell the truth. You don't know if you have physical courage until you might die or have suffered serious physical injury if you continue a particular course of action. You just don't know until it's tested. And so you can be tested by cruelty, and you can be tested by kindness. Can somebody be so kind as to essentially cause you to want to abandon your conviction to join their community? And so I think that one of the things that any one of us who suddenly finds ourselves sort of ideologically homeless, we have to ask ourselves as we long for community, at what cost do you seek that community? And that cost cannot be an abandonment of your core convictions and your core values.
Good evening. My name is Jonah. I'm not super familiar with microphones, so if I'm drifting back and forth and you can't hear me, just let me know.
Oh, you're fine.
Awesome. I was committed to democracy for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Both of my parents were or are employed at this university, volunteered for more political campaigns and movements than I can count. I worked for the Anne Frank House. I saw how the alternatives to democracy can go terribly wrong. And also, if there's anything that characterizes America now, it seems to be just entropy and decay. Those statistics you mentioned earlier, deaths of despair, all of these things that are symptomatic of moral failing, but at the end of the day are just, obvious signs of human suffering and things gone badly wrong. I think everyone in this room wants to fix that. And what I have observed over the past few years is the only people or places that I see fixing these problems. I see Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. I see Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. I see this centralization of command as a solution to problems. And although I believe that the small L liberalism you described, where people live and let live and people with different values are able to live out those values without fear of either being oppressed by another community or they themselves oppressing another community, I don't understand how we get back to that, or even just back to a place of basic physical competency where we could talk about infrastructure, we could talk about the many problems America has. I don't see how we get back to healthy small L liberalism or just a reversal of this entropy where things aren't going wrong without there being some unity of command, some authoritarian to set it right.
Well, can I first thank you for something?
Sure.
Thank you for not saying Hungary.
Hungary's a terrible example. They haven't done it.
Yeah, so thank you for not saying Hungary first of all. Look, so Singapore and El Salvador are two very, very different countries, both very, very small, extremely culturally homogenous, who are about as different from the United States of America as night is from day, right? And so, yeah, there's been a massive crackdown on crime in El Salvador that has, worked so far. It's worked so far. My view on authoritarianism is it is a brutalizing system of government and is a corrupting system of government. So it both brutalizes in that it teaches that the wielding of power is often as a good in and of itself. And it fails to acknowledge the fallenness of those who wield power. And so often what ends up happening, and we've seen this for a long time, this story that the West is in decay or the West is in decline and the West is corrupt and the West is decadent, is a story that has been told again and again and again in history. If you go back and you read, for example, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is a heavy lift, man. But if you read it, the fascist and the Japanese imperial powers were absolutely in the grips of this notion that the West was just too weak and too corrupt and had entropy, and it just couldn't withstand the united might of a disciplined and orderly people. And those turned out to be some of the most brutal and corrupt regimes that ever inhabited the planet. A lot of the communist argument throughout the Cold War, and I remember in 81 and 82 reading books about the decline of the West. And I will tell you, as bad as things seem right now in the United States of America in 2023, it ain't 1979. Oh my gosh, 1979. We had social entropy. We had a corrupt president resign 5 years before. We had finished a round of riots in American cities that make 2020 look as if it was an era of relative calm. We finished a round of domestic bombings in the United States of America that, in I believe it was 68 or 69, the year of the bomb, there was an average of more than one domestic terror bombing in the United States a day. A day. Sexual revolution was at its absolute height. The abortion rate was skyrocketing. The Soviet Union seemed ascendant on every front. On every front. It had appeared to successfully invade Afghanistan. Its armed forces swamped ours. It had finally closed the nuclear gap. We were a nation in decline by every measure. And then we did not right ourselves through authoritarianism at all. How do we right ourselves? Through the very philosophy that I articulated at the beginning of this, was that, if you go back and you read Reagan's speeches, if you go back and you look at Reagan's philosophy, one of his points to the American people was, you have not failed, you have been failed. And who has failed you? Who has failed you is this large, centralized, increasingly powerful federal government. And so one of the things about authoritarianism also, from the outside, is it's very good at masking its weakness. Now, Singapore, I'm putting in its own little box. Singapore seems to be a functioning country. I don't think I'd want to live there, but it seems to be a functioning little country for Singaporeans. For authoritarians, it reminds me of the way socialists look to Sweden. Sweden, we can be like Sweden. No, we cannot be like Sweden. Authoritarians say Singapore. No, we cannot be like Singapore. We're the United States of America. And I think one thing that's very interesting about that is exposing the inherent rottenness, even of Christian-themed authoritarianism, is what we're seeing unfold in eastern Ukraine right now. What we're seeing unfold in eastern Ukraine, there was prior to, and even still some people now, prior to February 24th, 2022, there was a rising strain of people on the right who saw the apparent winning streak of Vladimir Putin, saw his doubling down on creating a Christian identity and recreating a Christian identity for the Russian people, his absolute adamant opposition to wokeism as a symbol of strength, and our inability, the West's inability prior to February 24th, 2022 to resist Russian aggression time and time and time again as an evidence of Western failure and Western decay. And has happened since February 24th is a repeat of what has happened time and time again in the last 250 years of history, and that is the authoritarian governments ran up against the allegedly decadent West and the decadent small L liberal states and received a lesson in where real strength lies. And I think that is something that is very, very important for people to realize when they see the weaknesses. And the other thing that was important to understand about seeing our weaknesses is because we're a free society, we talk about them. We air them out. We make them known. We leave no stone unturned in talking about our problems. And that's actually one of the ways that we deal with them and solve them. Whereas an authoritarian structure covers over weaknesses. It papers them over. It conceals them because the existence of weaknesses, existence is evidence of failure. And so I think that if you take a look at the sweep of history, the United States of America has been in a much worse position, even in my lifetime. B, authoritarian countries have consistently underestimated the strength of small L liberal democracies. Is that an A and a B? Now I'm on C. I don't want to Rick Perry this. Okay. And then C, we've got a living example right in front of us of the failure even of Christian authoritarianism and the brutality of Christian authoritarianism in what we've seen in the fields of eastern Ukraine. So beware of falling in the trap that many people have fallen into of seeing a country that is not our country, that is dramatically culturally different, dramatically different on every front, and crucially dramatically smaller, and saying that could be us.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, we have to. There's like a long queue, so I just want to make sure that thank you
again
for
for not saying Hungary. I appreciate it.
Can I get back in line?
You can try, sure, but it's a long line. Okay, next question.
Hey, thank you for coming tonight. So I actually read your book, Divided We Fall, this week in preparation for the talk, but my question has nothing to do with that.
You look like a scholar and a gentleman.
I'm neither, but I try to be, hopefully one day. But my question is pertaining to your military service, if you don't mind. I recently joined the Army Reserves for when I attend law school, and then hopefully pursuing a career as a JAG as well.
Oh,
so what advice would you have for me that's pursuing that career of what to expect, and what, I guess, what did you wish you had known when you entered into
Oh, that's
that
a
field?
good question. Man, I could talk for a long time, so there's people behind you, but find me after, and I can give you some more advice. But a couple of things. One, never forget that JAG officer is also a soldier. So you're a lawyer and a soldier. And you're going to be entering the service as an officer, and very quickly you'll be a captain. So you'll be outranking, of course, all the enlisted soldiers and outranking many of your officer peers. And one of the things is they're going to look at you with inherent skepticism because you're not combat arms, right? You're a lawyer, and the only people that are hated more than lawyers are journalists. So, like, I've hit it all, man. And so what you want to do is, in addition to your legal excellence, the best piece of advice that I got was be a soldier. And that means absolutely maintain fitness, maintain military bearing, learn how to use your weapons. And the best piece of advice that I got was he says, the first combat arms unit you join, find the senior most friendly NCO, Sergeant Major preferably, and just walk up to him and say, Sergeant Major, I'm a JAG officer, but I still need to be a leader, and I want you to take me under your wing and teach me. And I did that the second day I landed in Iraq. I found Sergeant Major Taylor, who was one of the finest men I've ever known, and I said, Sergeant Major, I'm not just a JAG officer, I'm a reserve JAG officer, and I'm in an active duty unit. And I just want you to, when it comes to soldier skills, I need a mentor. And number one, nobody loves being a mentor more than a senior NCO. And number two, that act of humility actually makes you a better soldier. Because believe you me, you don't know anything. So that's the short version. I can give you the legal long version later.
Okay,
Brilliant, thank you.
excellent. So this is going to be the last question, just because I know that our IT people are expecting this to be done at 8:30. So yeah, final question, and then if people want to ask David questions afterwards, we'll hang out.
Hello, Mr. French. I have read several of your articles for various magazines such as the New York Times and what's the other one, National Review?
Yeah.
I really enjoy your work because you're like a beacon of nuance in this polarized extreme culture we live in. But what I wanted to ask you is, what is the best way for us as Americans to combat the extreme, polarized, ugly culture that we live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, look, not one of us is powerful enough, influential enough.
Yes.
But the very most basic thing is you have to live the values you want to uphold. That's just the most basic thing. And you have to start early. You have to get in the habit of living and practicing the virtues that you want to see more broadly in society. And so it really is kind of that simple with some extra addenda, and the extra addenda include this. We live in a super polarized society, so it's easy to feel cocooned. And to fall into a cocoon. And when you fall into a cocoon, you're drawn towards extremism. Because there's this concept in my book I talk about called the law of group polarization. And when like-minded people gather, they become more extreme. Mm-hmm. And so what I say is, you might not live and be around a whole lot of people who disagree with you, but what you want to do is you want to seek out the best expression of the opposing side's point of view. So only read the best. You can find cruddy people to read that will totally reaffirm how awesome you are and how bad they are, but find the best expression of the opposing side's point of view. And then the other thing that I say is read an idea's proponent before you read its opponent. So let's say you have a concept that you've never heard of before or are vaguely aware of, like, I don't know, let's pull one at random, critical race theory. Read a critical race theorist first, right, so that you understand their argument from their voice, and then go read an intelligent critic of critical race theory. And I think, honestly, y'all, that is a key way to approach the public square. It is so important, but because most of the time, let's be honest, here's what we do. You learn something new from, say, your opponents, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to a friendly outlet to you to read the debunking. You know, critical race theory, I have not heard of this before. Let's see what they say about it on National Review. Well, yes, read National Review on critical race theory, but learn what it is first and then read the debunking or the opposition. And I promise you that is a way that introduces nuance. You're going to learn something, and it helps prevent you from demonizing your opponents.
All right, thank you. It was a real treat to get to see you tonight.
Okay, well, let's thank David for joining us. And that's it for our event. We'll be hanging out on stage for a few minutes if you have some lingering questions. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.